All right, so have you seen this headline that's been making the rounds? It's about dire wolves.
Dire wolves.
Yeah, dire wolves, like from Game of Thrones, the ones on the Stark banners. People are saying they've been brought back, like from extinction.
Oh, wow. That's something.
Right. It's like something straight out of like fantasy or something.
So, who's claiming they brought them back?
It's this company called Colossal Biosciences. They're based in the US, founded by this entrepreneur, Ben Lamm, and a pretty famous geneticist, George Church.
Colossal Biosciences, huh?
Yeah. And get this, they announced it back on October 1st, 2024, last year. Like they're saying dire wolves are back, walking the earth again after being extinct for like, what, over 10,000 years?
Well, they've certainly got people's attention. I'm intrigued, but also a little skeptical, to be
Oh,
honest.
yeah, for sure. And for those of you who maybe haven't been following all this de-extinction stuff, Colossal, they're not exactly new to this whole, bringing back extinct creatures thing.
Right, right.
Like just before this whole dire wolf announcement, they made a big splash with their woolly mice.
Well, woolly mice. Yeah, I remember that.
Which, a lot of people saw as like a stepping stone to their big ultimate goal, bringing back the woolly mammoth.
Ambitious, to say the least.
Totally. But, okay, back to these dire wolves. For those of you who might not know, dire wolves, they weren't just your average everyday wolves,
Right.
We're talking like huge, like up to 3.5 feet tall at the shoulder, over 6 feet long,
Oh.
and could weigh over 150 pounds.
Yeah, they were formidable predators.
Definitely. And apparently they had these like amazing white coats, roamed all over like southern Canada, the US, hunted some pretty massive prey too, like horses, bison, even possibly mammoths.
Wow.
Yeah, it's thought they died out around 13,000 years ago, probably because of their prey dying out. And well, humans hunting them too.
That's a familiar story.
Unfortunately, yeah. But okay, here's the thing. You can't talk about dire wolves without mentioning like Game of Thrones, right?
Of course. The Starks, their whole sigil is a dire wolf.
Exactly. So, it's not just some obscure fossil we're talking about. It's this creature that's like captured our imagination through pop culture.
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer to this whole de-extinction claim. People are already fascinated by dire wolves, and now they're being told they're back. It's, well, it's a big deal.
Huge. So Colossal, they're saying they've essentially like engineered their return through these three, get this, genetically modified gray wolf pups.
Genetically modified wolf pups.
Yeah. And they've even given them these very fitting names. Romulus and Remus, they were born last October. And then Khaleesi, she was born in January.
Wow.
Right. And they're keeping them in this like super private facility, 2,000 acres, up in the northern U.S.
So that's their evidence, these three pups.
That's what they're presenting, yeah. But of course, the big question is, how? How did they supposedly do this, bring back a creature that's been extinct for thousands of years? It's like something out of a movie,
Right. It sounds pretty unbelievable.
Right.
So what's the science behind it all? Like, how did they actually do this de-extinction thing?
Okay, so from what I've been reading, it's pretty complicated.
I can imagine.
They basically started by reaching out to, like, museums, research institutions, trying to get their hands on any dire wolf remains they could find.
Makes sense. You need the source material, so to speak.
Exactly. And they managed to get a 13,000-year-old tooth and a 72,000-year-old skull. Pretty amazing, really.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
To think that we can still find such well-preserved remains after all this time.
I know. And the key, according to their team, led by this scientist, Beth Shapiro, their chief science officer, the key was this part of the skull called the petrous bone. Apparently, it's super dense and really good at preserving DNA.
Interesting.
Yeah. And from those two samples, they were actually able to reconstruct not one, but two complete dire wolf genomes.
2 complete genomes. Wow. That's a huge accomplishment in itself.
It's mind-blowing, right? It's like we're suddenly able to read the genetic blueprints of these creatures that walked the earth, like, way before us.
It's incredible what science can do these days.
So once they had those genomes, they compared them to, like, modern-day canids, like coyotes, and, most importantly, gray wolves.
Gray wolves being the closest living relative to dire wolves.
Exactly. And they found this, like, crazy high similarity in the DNA, like 99.5% similar to gray wolves.
Wow, that's incredibly close.
I know. But here's where it gets really interesting. They then used like super advanced gene editing technology to make a bunch of targeted edits to the gray wolf genome.
Gene editing, like CRISPR stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But they weren't just, randomly messing around with the genes. They made like 20 specific edits across 14 different
So a
genes.
very targeted approach.
Super targeted. And they focused on genes that are known to like influence traits like coat color, hair length, body size, muscle structure, basically all the things that make a dire wolf look like a dire wolf.
So they're basically like tweaking the gray wolf DNA to make it more dire wolf-like.
Exactly. And then the final step, they took these like gene-edited fertilized dire wolf eggs and they implanted them into surrogate dog mothers
Wow.
who then carried the pregnancies to term and gave birth to these 3 pups.
So those pups, they're the result of like a combination of ancient DNA analysis, modern gene editing, and surrogate pregnancy.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's what Colossal is presenting as, functional copies of dire wolves. But of course, the big question that everyone's asking is, are they really dire wolves?
Right. Like, is that what a dire wolf actually is?
Yeah, I mean, 99.5% similar to gray wolves. That sounds really close. But as a lot of reports have been pointing out, the gray wolf genome is huge, like 2.4 billion base pairs.
That's massive.
So even that tiny 0.5% difference could still represent millions of differences in their actual genetic code.
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder how we even define what a species is, you know?
Right. And it gets even more complicated because there was this big study back in 2021, published in Nature, that suggested that gray wolves and dire wolves, they actually diverged like way earlier than we thought, like 6 million years ago.
6 million years.
Yeah. So even if they look similar on the surface, they've actually had a lot of time to evolve separately.
That's a huge amount of time for genetic differences to accumulate.
Totally. So how does Colossal, address this? How do they justify saying these pups are dire wolves when there's this 6 million year gap in their evolutionary history?
Well, their argument hinges on how we define a species, which, as you pointed out, is a really complex question.
Right.
Their chief science officer, Beth Shapiro, she makes the point that species definitions are basically human constructs. Like, we've created these categories to try and make sense of the natural world.
Which can get messy, especially when you're talking about things like, extinct species and ancient DNA.
Absolutely. So Colossal, they're leaning on what's called the morphological species concept, which basically means if it looks like a dire wolf, walks like a dire wolf, then it's a dire wolf. They're focused on the physical traits.
So if it looks the part, it is the part.
Yeah. But of course, a lot of other scientists, they use a different concept called the phylogenetic species concept, which is much more focused on evolutionary relationships and genetic history.
So how closely related two species are and how long ago they diverged.
Exactly. And Shapiro, she acknowledges that, yeah, these different definitions can lead to different interpretations, and that both can be valid depending on how you're looking at it.
So it's not just some abstract scientific debate. It actually has real-world consequences for how we see these pups.
Totally. If we define them as dire wolves, then it's like this huge, we brought them back from the dead moment. But if we don't, then it's more like a really cool example of genetic engineering, but not true de-extinction.
And that changes how we value them, how we think about conservation, all that.
Definitely. And it raises questions about what these pups, even if they do look like dire wolves, can actually do. Like, can they really function like their extinct ancestors?
That's a good point.
Right. Like, these pups, they don't have any actual dire wolf parents. They've never even met another wolf, let alone a dire wolf. They haven't learned any of the behaviors that would have been passed down through generations.
Like how to hunt, how to socialize, all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Colossal has said they don't plan on releasing them into the wild, and they're only going to breed a few more.
So no packs of dire wolves roaming the forests anytime soon.
Probably not. And this actually reminds me of that story about the bucardo, the Pyrenean ibex. It was briefly brought back through cloning, but then it died out again almost immediately. It shows that there's a lot more to de-extinction than just creating a living animal. You have to think about their behavior, their environment, their whole ecological role.
Right. It's a lot more complicated than just, poof, they're back.
Definitely. And all this has led to a lot of skepticism from other scientists.
Yeah, not everyone's buying into Colossal's claims.
Right. There are some pretty prominent voices, like Philip Seddon, he's a zoologist, and Dr. Nick Rawlins, a paleogeneticist. They're both from the University of Otago. And they've been pretty vocal about their doubts.
What are they saying?
Well, they're basically saying that these pups are more accurately described as, genetically modified gray wolves, or even hybrids.
Not true dire wolves.
Right. And Rawlins, he especially emphasizes how difficult it is to work with ancient DNA. He uses this great analogy. He says it's like taking fresh DNA and sticking it in a 500-degree oven overnight.
Ouch.
Yeah. You're basically left with these tiny fragments, like shards and dust. You can try to piece them back together, but it's never going to be the same as the original.
So you can't just, like, extract some ancient DNA and magically create a baby dire wolf.
Nope. It's way more complicated than that.
So how did Colossal actually do it then, if it's not just straight up cloning?
So what they did was they used this technique called synthetic biology. They basically took what little information they could get from those ancient samples and use it to identify key DNA sequences associated with dire wolf traits.
Okay.
And then they use that information to edit the genome of a living gray wolf.
So they're basically taking a gray wolf and giving it a few dire wolf-like features.
Exactly. And Rollins points out that they only made 20 edits across 14 genes out of like 19,000 genes in the gray wolf genome.
So it's like a tiny fraction of the overall genetic makeup.
Yeah. But, Shapiro, she argues that recreating those physical characteristics, that's enough to qualify as de-extinction, especially given how closely related dire wolves and gray wolves are.
It all comes back to that question of how we define a species.
Exactly. But Rollins, he counter-argues that, look, dire wolves and gray wolves, they belong to entirely different genera. Like, that's a pretty significant evolutionary distinction. And millions of years of separate evolution, that's not something you can just erase with a few gene edits.
It's like they're two branches on a tree that split off a long time ago.
Right. And this whole debate is perfectly illustrated by that Time magazine cover. The one with the white wolf and the headline about the dire wolf's return. It shows how the public perception of this whole thing can be very different from the scientific reality.
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than just, dire wolves are back.
For sure. And another interesting detail from that Time article, the pups were all born via C-section.
Mm.
Probably to minimize any complications.
So it was a very controlled process.
Totally. And, this whole thing, it raises some really big questions, like Rollins. He worries about the message it sends. If we could just bring back extinct species, does that make us less careful about protecting the ones we have now?
Like, why bother with conservation if we can just rewind the clock?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole question of, who gets to decide which species get brought back, and what are the potential ecological impacts of introducing these essentially new creatures into existing ecosystems.
It's a lot to think about.
Definitely. And it's not just scientists who are interested in this. Colossal. They've got some pretty big names backing them, like Tom Brady, Tiger Woods, Paris Hilton, even Peter Jackson, the director.
Wow, that's a lot of star power.
Right. It shows how this whole idea of de-extinction has really captured the public imagination. And it also means they've got a lot of money to throw at this.
Yeah, I'm sure those investors are eager to see some results.
For sure. And Tom Brady, he even posted on Instagram about how proud he was of the team.
So it's not just a scientific project. It's become this whole, cultural phenomenon.
Absolutely. And, the dire wolf, it's not the only extinct creature they're targeting.
Oh, yeah. What else is on their list?
Well, they're working on the woolly mouse, which is basically a stepping stone to their ultimate goal of bringing back the woolly mammoth. They're hoping to have that done by 2028.
Ambitious.
Super ambitious. But they've also had some success with cloning critically endangered red wolves, which, that's a really important conservation achievement.
Absolutely. Saving existing species is just as important as bringing back extinct ones.
Totally. And they've also got their sights set on the dodo bird and the Tasmanian tiger.
Wow, they're really going for it.
Yeah, Colossal CEO Ben Lamm, he called the birth of these dire wolf pups a demonstration of their end-to-end de-extinction technology stack. Like, they're saying they've figured out the process, and now they're just going to apply it to other species.
So where does this leave us? It's a really interesting situation, right?
It is. On one hand, you've got this incredible scientific and technological achievement. It's captured the world's attention, and it's got all these celebrities and investors throwing money at it. But on the other hand, there's this big debate within the scientific community about whether these pups can really be considered dire wolves.
Right. It's like a clash between scientific progress and biological reality.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, it's important to understand both sides of this.
Yeah, so to wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Colossal Biosciences has done something remarkable. Like, they've created these animals that look a lot like dire wolves. And that's a testament to how far we've come in genetics and gene editing.
Absolutely. But it's also crucial to remember what the experts are saying. Like, a lot of them are arguing that these pups are more accurately described as genetically modified gray wolves rather than a true resurrection of the dire wolf.
And that leads us to some pretty big questions for you, the listener. Like, what does it actually mean to bring back an extinct species? Is it enough to just recreate the physical appearance? Or do we need to consider the genetics, the behavior, the ecological role, the whole package?
And how might this kind of technology change how we think about extinction? Does it make us less concerned about losing species if we think we can just bring them back?
Right. Like, what are the ethical implications of all this? And who gets to decide which species get brought back and why?
It's a whole new world of possibilities, but also a lot of potential pitfalls. So we encourage you to keep learning about this. Dive deeper into the science of genetics, explore the complexities of defining a species, and follow the ongoing discussions about de-extinction. Because this conversation, it's just getting started.
And who knows what the future holds? Maybe we will see dire wolves roaming the earth again someday, but maybe it'll be something different, something entirely new that we haven't even imagined yet. It's an exciting time to be alive, that's for sure.
I'll say.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.